Good day, and welcome to Donald Ransford's Weekly Wraps. I am Viv Govender. This week we're going to do things a little differently just because of the news events that have occurred. Basically, we're going to be covering the Trump tariff in detail, look at its effect on the global economy and on the tech sector in particular, as well as the impact it might have on emerging markets, especially South Africa. So, this week Trump announced his tariffs on what was called Liberation Day. He calls them reciprocal tariffs. So he's saying that he's only doing to other countries what they are doing to the US at the moment. However, what he's counting on as tariffs are things that are not generally listed as tariffs. So for instance, he's putting VAT as a tariff on US goods. He's obviously also looking at things like, any kind of regulatory kind of tariffs or monetary tariffs, etc. Or non-tariff restrictions on trade. And if you looked at the scope and the size of these tariffs, they were probably at the high end of what had been hoped for. Markets had been predicting somewhere between 300 to maybe closer to $1 trillion worth of tariffs. It was definitely near the $1 trillion, the $300 level, $300 billion level. Sorry. This is obviously negative for global markets, and we saw that happen. Saw the reaction on the day. Like a 4% pullback in the Nasdaq, almost that same amount in the S&P 500. Massive decreases in companies like Amazon and even things like Apple and Nike, etc. And the reason is quite simple. These companies depend a lot on international trade, especially from places like China, to fund their businesses. And with these big tariffs, they're going to have to basically either increase their prices significantly, or find new sources of imports, or even have to produce things locally. Which is going to be quite difficult if you look at just how expensive it is to produce in the US, especially some of the high tech stuff. Even though there's a lot of value add to it, there is a specialization that's basically occurred in China and other parts of the world over the last several decades, and it's quite difficult for any country, even the US, to replicate that in a period of like months or even years. And so that's why, for instance, if you want to be producing Nike shoes in in the US versus producing it in like Vietnam, where a lot of them produce at the moment, firstly you're going to have more expensive workers, and those workers are not even going to be as productive as the Vietnamese because they don't have the specialization just yet. You want to produce iPhones in the US versus in China, again, very expensive to produce it in the US, and you're not going to have the same level of productivity because it's, you may argue that, it's low cost labor in China, but it's also highly skilled labor to do a lot of these things. It's not just, something that anybody off the street can just up and just start doing the same day. Now, if you look at what the impact is going to have on the global economy, first thing to be noted is that we don't know for certain what is actually going to be, coming into play. I mentioned Vietnam. It looks like the Vietnamese have just basically capitulated and they're going to have, virtually no tariffs for the US, and let's see that gets them off the bad books of Trump. We are likely to see similar capitulation from a number of smaller countries. I think places like, towards Mexico, etc., probably, there's not much they can do. The entire economy of Mexico depends on its trade with the US. A lot of the trade with Canada, even though they've made some really strong statements against the US recently, depends on their trade with the US. These countries have very little choice about what they can do going forward, at least in the short term. So they pretty much have to do what the US says. We'll probably see more of a reaction from places like China as well as the EU. And I think that's remains to be seen exactly what's going to be happening between those areas. The tariffs on China are pretty spectacular, considering just all involved is in excess of 50%. If you look at all the tariffs, not just this round, but other rounds included as well, on Chinese imports. The Chinese have, for the last little while, tried to change their economy and try to become more of a consumer-based economy, but they haven't done it yet. These kind of tariff levels are going to be quite difficult for them to handle. The US is still a huge customer to them. If you look at the number of Chinese companies that depend on the US for their profitability, it's going to make a huge impact on them. And we're also likely to see, especially from the bigger countries like China, as well as the bigger regions like the EU, retaliation. If you don't think that you can have any kind of deal reasonably done with the US, it doesn't really cost you much to go and retaliate. In addition to that, we've also seen a kind of a cultural pushback on these tariffs. They've kind of offended certain places, like the Canadians, for instance. Beyond what the government's talking about, the Canadian people are very offended by what's been done to them by the US. You've seen, for instance, I've talked about it before, booing of the U.S. national anthem, cancelling of deals with Starlink, and we've also seen that kind of thing happening elsewhere in the world as well, where companies that have a very U.S. kind of branding have been kind of negatively affected by this particular thing. Tesla, for one, has been quite negatively affected by what's happened with regards to the Trump tariffs. Speaking of which, by the way, it looks rather clear that Elon Musk is not going to last much more or spend much more time at Doge. Some people argue that this is because of backlash of his companies. I think it's more to do with the fact that he really can't take that kind of time away from his companies to just focus on the government. He's doing things with Tesla as well as with SpaceX, let alone Neuralink and some of these other companies as well, like XAI and X, which is now obviously been acquired by XAI. That I don't think just considering the workload he has in these companies, that he can afford to spend much more time on Doge. But this, until that, what he's done so far has associated him enough with the Trump administration. He's also feeling a bit of a negative kickback coming through. So we are starting to see an increase in international tensions. We are starting to see a little kind of revamping of international alliances. There is even talk of Canada joining the EU. However, does North America and Canada become part of the European Union? European in that thing is obviously an operative term. It's quite difficult to understand, but there is talks of that happening. Also, in regards to towards the Asian countries, apparently Japan, Korea, and China have come to some kind of or had some kind of meetings with regards to trying to find a way to coordinate the response to what's happening in the US. Now, there's been some kickback on that because obviously the Japanese and the Koreans are much more closely related to the US because of things like, for instance, the military protection provided to them by the US. But I do think that it kind of would make sense for them to have some kind of discussion because the Japanese and Koreans are not as badly affected as the Chinese, but they have had some significant tariffs put on them at the moment. And someone mentioned the fact that the last time these countries cooperated, they were fighting Genghis Khan. So there has been a bit of a revamp in terms of global alliances. Even countries like Australia, which have been traditionally very supportive of the US, are being affected by these tariffs, and I think they are going to also face political pressure to go against the US and possibly even have agreements with neighbors that in the past they were not as aligned with. Maybe not China, but places like Indonesia, etc., might be into play there. And we are starting to see as well what Trump is doing having political effects. A number of places in the world, for instance, Canada about to have elections, Australia about to have elections, and until Trump's inauguration, it appeared that the Conservatives were going to win quite handily in both those places. Right now, it's a toss-up in Canada. It's maybe even in favor of the Liberal Party in Australia. Even in places like Europe, people like Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage are reasonably closely related to Trump or associated with Trump, are likely to find a bit of a negative feedback coming through to them. A place like the AFD, a place like Germany with the AFD, with support from Elon Musk, are likely to find a negative feedback coming to them because of what's been happening with regards to these tariffs. So, to basically give you an overall picture, tariffs bigger than expected, and having, I think, a effect on the global political scene and economic scene that is probably going to be productive for the US. It's going to make partners out of places that were not partners in the past, and these partnerships are going to be primarily aligned against the US because of the fact that the US is seen as the aggressor in this scenario. And going beyond that, I do think longer term, these tariffs are going to be counterproductive for the US. We are likely to find trade agreements that kind of bypass the US. We're going to find economic activity kind of walking around the US. Think about it. Canada trying to become part of the EU, possibly become part of the EU, when their closest neighbor is the US. That doesn't make sense economically. The only reason they would even look at that is because of these tariffs. Okay, agreements between China, Japan, and Korea geopolitically doesn't make sense. when the Koreans basically and the Japanese, the major geopolitical rival they have is the Chinese. They have territorial disputes, the Chinese and the Japanese. This piece of land that the Japanese have, that the Chinese say is theirs. The Koreans basically, South Koreans, let me be specific, are still technically at war with the North Koreans. And the North Koreans are basically a proxy state of the Chinese. So it doesn't kind of make sense from that point of view as to why they'd be teaming up. But these tariffs kind of make these bedfellows come to play. Now, what you must understand is longer term, like I say, this is probably negative for the US. In the short term, however, the US has been such a large player in the global economy and been so instrumental in creating the systems that we currently deal with in the global economy, especially around places like Japan, Korea, Australia, the EU, etc., Canada, that it's going to be quite difficult for these places to adjust in the short term. And so we're likely to get a lot of concessions being made really quickly from the smaller places. And even the EU is going to find it difficult, I think, to really break away from the US in any reasonable amount of time. But longer term, I think these tariffs and these moves the Trump administration are making right now is going to significantly harm the US's place in the world. And not just from a point of view of jobs and so on in the short term, but in terms of the dollar as a central part of the global financial system, as the US financial system has been the central part of the global economy. I don't see how in 5 or 10 years' time, places like the EU are going to be a significantly larger part. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to speaking again next week. Cheers.